Good morning. My name is Nick Allard. I'm the President and Dean of Brooklyn Law School. For those of you who know that I'm Catholic and ex-altar boy, it may not surprise you that I observe Lent, but for those of you who know me, it may surprise you that what I gave up for Lent was bragging. Oh, come on, that's pretty funny. And it's not going very well. It's hard. I mean, put yourself in my shoes. Every day, I come to work at this great institution, and I get to work with people like Jim Fanto, Roberta Carmel, Professor Carmel, Ted Janger, who I understand is not able to be here today, and all the rest. And you know, I say this all the time, but it's one of the times when I'm not embellishing at all. We have a world-class faculty, world-class. You can go right down the list. It's extraordinary. And I'm so glad that they have assembled, and Jim has assembled here, similar scholars of that stature for our program today on a critically timely and important topic. But you know, something also, if you permit me to digress for just a minute, and I will tie it in to the topic of this program. You know, something very exciting is going on. I think increasingly in Brooklyn, but also across the country, people are understanding that the mission of law schools and legal education is to be centers for learning how to use the power of law in the service of people in society, at home and abroad. And there's something very exciting going on. You know, we're on the verge at this law school for the fourth year in a row of having 90% of our students have jobs within 9 months of graduation. And you know, that's an arbitrary date, 9 months, and you all know why we focus on that date. But that's remarkable, and I know that many of the students who are waiting for jobs now are ones who are waiting for top jobs, you know, in the district attorney's office in Kings County and Queens County and Manhattan and other really plum jobs. And so it's not really a question of any deficiency or that they're shooting too low, but that, you know, it takes time to find the right job. But that's an exciting fact. And I've also learned, and I'm not allowed to tell you this, so I won't, but that at this law school, our applications are up tremendously from the previous year. And in fact, they're up very, very dramatically relative to some other spots, but I think that the wave is lifting. So I think that this idea about the power of law to make a difference and the inspiration people have to become lawyers and to address the tough issues that really are solved by law is catching on and is very promising for the future. Now, when I said at home and abroad, that's just not happy talk and big words. Increasingly, we're living in an international, intertwinkled global economy and community, and lawyers everywhere must have an understanding of what it is to practice in a global world. Just this morning, I had an invitation. I understand we are taping this here. I had an invitation from the St. Petersburg International Legal Forum to send them taped content on issues that our faculty are addressing that is recorded on especially commercial and business issues of importance in the United States. And also, this may surprise you to know, they're very interested in the content of the Free Speech First Amendment Symposium that we had here last week. Now, nobody needs to get worried. Nobody's going to send anything that you are not happy with, you know, without your permission to Putin for him to review and record. But I just want to mention that the quality of the scholarship and the work that's going on here has caught attention elsewhere outside of our borders. So I'm really looking forward to you having a great day on this program about the link between compliance and technology, and it's certainly a timely issue. It is an indispensable tool, and it does pose a threat. I know with markets, sometimes the technology seems to take on a life of its own, and things get out of hand, and maybe move faster than regulators and others who are able to protect their interests are able to move, just as one example. So this is a hugely engaging topic. I wish I could be with you today. I try to participate and listen in and learn as much as possible. I have a very ill family member who I'm going to run off, who's now in hospice, and try to say goodbye to. Otherwise, I would be here. Believe me, I would rather be with you here today. But I wish you all the very best. And Jim, I'm really grateful for you putting in the time and energy and worrying this program to perfection as you do. For all the participants, for the great attendance on a snowy Friday, and also to the Brooklyn Journal of Corporate, Financial, and Commercial Law for their hard work, and I'm looking forward also to the papers appearing so that this program today will have a life and afterlife, go on and inform us on all of these issues. And thanks to Liz Alpert. Liz, thank you very much back there. She's ensconced in conference working this. And to our entire staff who make these events possible. I'll give you one statistic that is not made up. Compared with 5 years ago, this law school puts on nine times as many programs as it did 5 years ago. It's sort of like Das Boot here with, hot bunks, move in, move out, one program after another, and our staff makes that all possible. Have a great day. Thank you all very much, and it's great to see you.
Okay, so I take the privilege of kicking this off with a talk on the use of technology by compliance, benefit, threat, or both. But I see my talk as really as an introduction to the conference, and I want to highlight several reasons why I believe compliance and technology is an important topic. And I just want to raise some issues that I think will be important and maybe the other speakers will address. So the outline of my talk you see up here as follows, is I'll lay out several of my assumptions about compliance, and maybe people will agree with me or disagree. Then I'll talk just briefly about the use of technology by compliance officers. And then I'll ask my question, does technology pose a threat to compliance? And then I'll present my hypothesis, which you'll see is kind of stark, that it does enhance compliance, but it threatens another side of compliance. Then I'll look at some evidence and then draw conclusions. Now, just a caveat here, and it's kind of applies to the group, is that this is a focus primarily on broker-dealer, investment advisor compliance, but people are free to talk about other kinds of compliance as well. Okay, so what do I have? Oh, point it there. Okay, good enough. So so first of all, wait, did I go too far? Okay, assumptions about compliance. My assumption, I have an assumption about that there's really two kinds of compliance, okay? I'm working under that assumption. The first of all, what I'd call legal compliance, which is what I think we often understand to be, when you think about compliance, it's have firms and employees conduct their business in accordance with the law, regulation, and professional standards. And it's what we understand, compliance practitioners understand compliance to be, have policies and procedures to ensure that people are complying with the law and regulation, train people on them, monitor for and follow up on any problems related thereto. This is the kind of compliance that's legally mandated in the broker-dealer and investment advisor world, okay? Now, what I say is there's another kind of compliance as well. I see that as something separate, and it will be interesting to see what people say about that. Now, I take this from organizational theorists, and it's what I would call, it's kind of a broader category. What I say is values, strategic, and advisory compliance. And I mean, Sean Griffith will talk about it. It's compliance aimed at upholding the values or culture of an organization. Now, it's also broader than that. It's compliance that contributes to business strategy. You might see it associated with compliance risk management, advising business personnel on appropriate conduct that's not always appropriate, meaning not always in accordance with law and regulation. Of course, but something more, in accordance with the organization's culture or values. So another way of saying this is that compliance officers are really promoters and representatives of the organizational values and culture, and very much involved in strategic decision making. And they're really overall advisors on this compliance culture. Okay, so I make this division between what I'd say legal compliance and this values compliance. Now, so that's my assumption about compliance. Now, secondly, talk about technology. Now, we'll talk a lot about technology today, and some of the speakers more than I mean, technology has always been part of the securities industry and actually part of the industry's compliance. I always like to roll out this old guide to broker-dealer compliance that I know some people on the panel know more than I, more about its origin, but it's this 1974 document that was done, I think, under the auspices of the SEC. It's very hard to locate, and it's a guide to broker-dealer compliance, done by the industry under the auspices of the SEC, but right there it highlights way back then about how important technology is in both the business and in compliance. I mean, it starts talking really for the first time about compliance officers in the industry. Now, technology, we know, is part of finance, has been there, and is so integrated with finance. And other speakers today, Onig and Tom, I think, will talk about it in more detail. And we think about it as part of trading strategy, investment strategy, and it brings with it, its own host of problems, such as cybersecurity. And Jennifer, I think her talk will deal with that. Now, as for compliance, technology and compliance, that in a way, technology helps compliance keep up with the use of technology in the securities business, particularly for surveillance purposes. Now, if you go to a typical industry compliance conference, there will be a whole set of technology vendors there who are talking to compliance officers and selling them products that are products, technological products, allowing compliance officers to keep up with the technology in the business side. And we can think just off the cuff that technology facilitates certain compliance tasks with respect to, for example, trade monitoring, communications review. It would be hard to imagine how you do it without technological tools. And I'll discuss some more of those below. And so I see technology, initially, with respect to compliance, that it helps very much on what I'd say is legal compliance. Although it could be used on this advisory values compliance as well. You can imagine technology facilitates face-to-face interaction between compliance officers and business people far away. So you'd say, well, it could be useful there. Now, remember I said when I posed a question for the conference, even though the speakers really can do what they want. But as the background question is, does technology pose any threats or problems to compliance and compliance tasks, or even to the position of compliance officers, or is it as typical of past technology? Is it just an unalloyed benefit? We've had past technology, and you say, okay, well, it's just something that's very useful. It's another tool, and that compliance officers can use. But I suggest, they said, well, it may be a threat. And then I say, well, if it is a threat, does it pose a problem to one of the kinds of technology, one of the kinds of compliance? That is to say, does it pose a problem to legal compliance or to values compliance? And then I offer my stark hypothesis. And my hypothesis is that, well, of course, technology is going to enhance the productivity of compliance officers, particularly in the area of legal compliance. I just suggested as much. And so I would suggest that what we're going to see is more and more investments in legal compliance technology. But then the question is, will that slow down the growth in the number of compliance officers? And now if that happens, you have more technology, or so the hypothesis goes, and fewer compliance officers, will that affect adversely the values compliance? Maybe simply by removing the compliance officers, eliminating the numbers and removing them from being on the ground. And any technological enhancement to values compliance may be not enough to compensate for the loss of compliance officers on the ground. So that's my hypothesis, or what I posed as a hypothesis, and also to suggest, well, maybe other speakers want to address that, or commentators. Now, what I then ask is there any evidence for the hypothesis, or where would one look? And so the first evidence, I'd say, is, are compliance officers using technology at all? Okay, and we'll see that that's a pretty easy to establish. The second one is the other piece of evidence that would be significant is, is technology increasing the productivity of compliance officers and then having an effect on the numbers of them? And then finally, maybe the hardest bit of evidence is it harming this values compliance? Or is it having an effect on any side of compliance? Okay, so now I look at these, admittedly not in the most empirically satisfactory way. I say, well, let's just look at the three kinds of evidence. First of all, are compliance officers using technology? And I said this is the one that's most easy to establish. That, and here I pull out a quotation from an SEC action against Citigroup, and it's just as an emblematic quotation that technological systems are allowing broker-dealers and advisors to fulfill effectively their compliance responsibilities. So it's assumed that they're using them, and that today the SEC and FINRA expect this. And they complain if firms do not have adequate technology, particularly with respect to what I'd call legal compliance and in the exercise of their surveillance responsibilities. So then I cite a few recent cases where you see the SEC complaining with respect to UBS as to its inadequate technology with respect to margin loans that were made to customers in a Cantor Fitzgerald case on automated compliance systems. In fact, what you see from the SEC today is that in disciplinary actions, oftentimes you have SEC faulting firms saying, why did you stick with a manual compliance practice? Why are you not automating things? I think that's the push that you see from the regulators. And even more so, if to take another example, is that regulators themselves, and I think Onig will talk more about this, have embraced surveillance technology, and they are in a way providing firms with models of how it's used. And I take an example from an OC recent report on retail sales of structured securities products, where this aspect, this branch of the SEC that's involved in examinations of firms says, look what we did. You know, we used data analytics to look through all the firm's data and identify problematic branches and firms that were improperly selling structured products. And I think the clear message to compliance staff is, why aren't you doing the same thing? You know, if we can do it, why aren't you using data analytics in the same way? Now, and I think, so looking around today, I think that, and again, just talking about the evidence for the use of technology, I think the push is today in compliance is that, wait, you know, you have to use the technology and you have to keep developing it, and maybe the movement in compliance is to have more compliance officers who have technological and data analytical skills, okay? And now this is all related for the most part to what I'd call legal compliance, you know, surveillance. Now, the second piece of evidence, I said, well, look, okay, they're using technology, and it seems to be there's a push to even increase this use. Secondly, is that increasing the productivity of compliance officers? And then secondly, is it threatening the growth of compliance, just the number of compliance officers? And I want to hear from people about that. Is it rationalizing the compliance profession? And again, my sense is, just based on reports in the compliance area, is of course there's a tremendous push in compliance today, and I want to hear from the commentators on this, is that, yeah, you have to be more productive as a compliance officer. And so any tool that increases your productivity will be valued and you have to take advantage of. And so all the reports on compliance today is that compliance as one part of the business firm has to be as productive as possible, and that cost pressures in the current market, particularly among the larger broker-dealers, the larger investment advisors, the larger banks, is to increase your productivity. So my question then is, well, and this would be something maybe some of the practitioners want to talk about, does compliance today get the kind of blank check that it has received in recent years after the financial crisis, where you thought, oh yes, you know, hire as many compliance officers as you can. My sense is now, well, no, the movement's back. No, you can hire as many compliance officers as you can. There's a need for productivity. Technology is the answer. Maybe fewer compliance officers and the use of technological tools. Now, this could lead to the outcome could be something like a centralized compliance function, a centralized surveillance function at which, you know, from on high or in some central location can conduct most of the compliance activities. Now, I think you have evidence of this happening. You know, in the Citigroup case that I mentioned before that was up on the earlier slide, what had actually happened in that case was that for cost savings purposes, this is stated in the case, and for a cheaper cost of living, Citigroup had moved its compliance function, its trading surveillance group, so the group that's looking over the trades, the proprietary trades and the other trades, and the trading desk in general, it had moved that function to Buffalo. It had formerly been located, I think, across the river in New Jersey, and therefore away from the trading activity. They said, oh, it's a cost savings. We can do everything remotely, and then it turns out not actually to work. If you look at this Wells Fargo case, it's a model of centralized home office compliance. because in Wells Fargo, you have certain kinds of compliance, the anti-money laundering, and suitability and sales practice compliance are done in central units within the home office, and then they work hand in hand with the branches and the different offices out in the field. So it's clearly a model that's being used and could develop. The Wells, and I'll come back to this, the Wells Fargo discipline, as you see there, it's related to a case of a prosecution of a compliance officer, Judy Wolf, which is known in the, this case is known in the compliance community. This is a woman who was prosecuted, a compliance officer, for altering her compliance documents. That she didn't, the question is, did she police adequately trading that was going on in a Florida branch? And it turned out it was insider trading going on. And then when this came to the fore and the SEC started to investigate it, she kind of backdated her reports to sort of justify what she did. And then the SEC prosecuted her for it. And then, even though not ever punishing her in any way in the final outcome. And this was the case against Wells Fargo. Now, so as you see, technology, so looking at the evidence, we have this centralized surveillance made possible by technology. And so it does seem to be rationalizing the function and may be moving the function outside, away from the ground and moving it into centralized locations. Now, I just caution, some of the evidence suggests, and again, what I want to suggest is, well, if they move everybody to the centralized locations, then maybe that'll result in a decrease in compliance officers and moving them out of the field. Because you don't need as many compliance officers if you're just there in some centralized location looking over all the firm. Now, I do caution, well, there's evidence that says other things are happening, so certainly technology could enhance the task of compliance officers. I think Tom will speak about this later on. Just think about what kind of expertise and time is needed to be a compliance officer in a high-frequency trading firm. And I don't know, maybe HJ will talk about that too, because he's not high-frequency firm, but in a more, complex trading environment. And you see today, if you look at this FINRA recent regulatory notice on control practices for algorithmic trading, they discuss, well, what kind of expertise do compliance officers actually need to police, the algorithmic trading. So it's possible that technology could increase the task of compliance officers and not go along with my evidence of a decrease in the number of them. And so, so we have to be aware of evidence that suggests the contrary, that we're not going to set the centralized model of compliance doesn't necessarily have to result in a decrease in the number of compliance officers. Now, I pick up another example from Fidelity that may go in this direction. Where Fidelity had a situation where someone posed as a broker, as a Fidelity broker, and then opened joint accounts with elderly clients and then depleted those accounts. Okay, and then Fidelity was blamed for not having found this, and part of the blame was, why didn't you have an automated system that would just flag this? Flag that this one client had all these accounts and they were all joint accounts with other people. And then Fidelity does at one point adopt that kind of technology, and then it turns out, and they actually hire more people to monitor the technology, But the issue, so you see in that kind of situation, then the increase in technology doesn't result in an increase in people power, more compliance officers to monitor it. So again, what I say then is that if you look at the evidence in the reported cases and settlement, is that there is a growth in centralized compliance made possible by technology, and that's focusing primarily on surveillance and monitoring. There's some indication that this kind of compliance is in response to cost pressures in firms, and they're trying to take advantage of the benefits of technology to reduce those pressures. It's less clear what effect that's having on staffing, okay? I mean, it may be reducing staffing. I want to hear from more people about that. Now, the final thing, and I don't have too much time, is there any evidence of this negative effect, this growth of technology and compliance? Is there evidence of a negative effect on what I call values or advisory compliance? And I just point out, I don't really have much to say about it. I say it would be a daunting empirical task. How would you show now that this increase in use of technology will negatively affect the values compliance? I mean, what would be the evidence for it? I mean, the decrease in the number of compliance officers, well, it's not clear that's happening. The movement of compliance officers out of the field into these centralized places, maybe that would be evidence for a negative effect on values and compliance. You'd have to get some evidence or some data on what the remaining compliance officers are doing. They're saying, well, we're devoting less time to counseling and upholding the organizational values. I don't know, would you do a survey of them? And then how do you control for other effects? And now what I've seen so far, I just have little data about that. And there's some existing reports that compliance officers are shying away from giving face-to-face advice, shying away from upholding organizational values. But I think that may be due to other reasons that the people in the room know about, which is the fear of supervisory liability. But I'm saying perhaps other data sources on this may emerge. Currently, FINRA is doing, I guess, a sweep, or as part of its regular examinations, it's looking at the culture of firms and asking firms, well, show us how you uphold your culture, how you maintain your organizational culture. Maybe something will come out of that. It will show what are compliance officers doing. Are they doing more surveillance, less values compliance? I don't know. Maybe some people have suggestions on where to look. Okay, and there are other effects of technology on values compliance. I mean, we just have to be aware there may be another story. I may be kind of barking up the wrong tree. It could well be that technology promotes values compliance, and insofar as technology just liberates people to spend more time on advising, because today we say, well, we'll just outsource a lot of the surveillance to some third party. They'll feed the exception reports and the problem areas back to the firm, and so you don't have to spend time as a compliance officer doing the actual surveillance. It's done for you, and so you have much more time to do the heavy valued one. So right now, I don't have much to say about any evidence of the negative effect on the values advisory compliance. And I just, in getting to my conclusion, I have to confess that when I did earlier work, and even, and published earlier work, I kind of assumed that this movement toward the centralized surveillance model of compliance, which is benefited by technology, was a threat. I just assumed it was a threat to values and strategic compliance. And because I had a fear that just when I feel compliance is becoming more established in financial firms and even becoming more of a profession, something that one of the commenters has written quite a bit about. I said just at that moment that this movement to more of a central supervisory compliance would take the compliance officer out of the field and kind of eliminate or push the compliance officer away from the most highly valued stuff that they do. And I saw technology as one of the reasons for that. But there were other reasons too, the supervisory liability issue and other things going on in the area. But I guess I have to recognize now that there's a more complicated interaction between compliance and technology, and I'm not sure it's having this effect, but I'd like to hear more what people say about it today. Okay, so in conclusion, as the kickoff talk for this conference, I just made a few points. First, that technology is becoming part of the necessary toolkit for compliance officers, and it's indeed insisted upon by the regulators. And secondly, it clearly enhances the productivity of compliance officers, I think particularly in what I call legal compliance, although not exclusively there. And then finally, thirdly, I say the data doesn't establish yet that it has reduced the number of compliance officers, but I think it's there as a potential threat. And then finally, I think more needs to be done, more needs to be looked at to understand how technology is affecting values compliance. But I look forward to hearing from all of you and the commentators about, well, what do you think? Where would you look for evidence on this hypothesis, particularly this last point on values compliance? What do you see as happening in the field on those issues? And do you even agree about this distinction between legal and values compliance? Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you, Jim, and thanks for inviting me. It's great to be here on this beautiful snowy day in Brooklyn. When Jim invited me here to talk about compliance in the financial services industry, I thought, what a wonderful opportunity to talk about German philosophy and Martin Heidegger, naturally. And so in the course of my remarks, I hope to establish, I hope to show that I'm not totally insane in thinking about Heidegger in connection with compliance and technology. And I hope a little bit to explain this view, which technology is horrifying, he says, because it transposes all that is out of its previous essence. So I'm going to take us back to first principles and start at a prior moment to where Jim started. And so it seems to me that to talk about the role of technology in compliance, we first have to ask two basic questions. First, what's compliance? Now, I have a slightly broader vision of compliance than the one that Jim articulated. I would disagree with the distinction that Jim makes about compliance. And I have defined compliance previously. Big picture, if you want to think about what compliance might mean, it's the means by which firms adapt their behavior, or the behavior of their agents, to the relevant nexus of legal, regulatory, and other kinds of norms. Now, that's sort of the highfalutin definition that brings in all sorts of things that compliance could be about. When you get down to where the rubber meets the road, it's really about the stuff that the government says that it's about. And one of the most important places where the government says what compliance is about is in the federal sentencing guidelines for organizations, where there are 7 minimal elements for an effective compliance program that every single corporation worries about. Now, in addition, corporations in particular industries have also got their industry-specific regulators. Jim mentioned FINRA and the SEC, telling them what compliance needs to be. So basically, compliance is this highfalutin idea, but at the end of the day, it's something that the government tells us that we have to do. What's technology then? So we all sort of have some idea what technology is. It's our smartphone. It's our computer. And if we were to be a little bit more thoughtful about it than that, maybe we would say something like technology is a means to an end. It's a tool. It's stuff that helps us do things more productively or efficiently or whatever. Now, here's where the Heidegger comes in. It's part of that. That's part of what it is. But when you make a thing into a tool to transform something else into a thing to be used for a purpose, you've given it a meaning. You've given the thing a meaning that it didn't necessarily have before you were using it in that way. So to Heidegger, technology is a way of enframing. It's a way of revealing what things are. And it's a way, and what it reveals is purpose and use. And what it reveals is endless purpose and use, endless plasticity and transformation of things. The problem, and the reason that he views technology as so horrifying, is that it's an occlusion of being. It hides things as they really are. Now, I promise this is going to be about compliance, but let me try to show you how. So what Heidegger says is the essence of technology does not lie in making and manipulating, nor in the using of means, but rather in the revealing of infinite plasticity. Now, and what he would tell us, or what Heidegger would have said about technology, is that technology has become the world. Technology reigns. Everything that we do through technology, and we therefore are separated from our being, and we don't even know what we've lost. So it's so pervasive that precisely nowhere does man, and Heidegger's talking about man, or human being, encounter himself anywhere as himself. He's lost his essence. So technology is something, it's a tool that can be used to change things, and therefore change the essence of things, and potentially occlude the essence of things. So that leads us to a third question. Now, we're talking about a corporation or a firm that has to comply. Well, now we have to talk about what's the essence of a corporation. What is that? And there are all kinds of ways of thinking about this, but what I'm going to suggest two really basic ones. The essence of a corporation is its culture. It's how it does what it does. It's the way in which it does its business. It's how it does its business. It's how it serves or accommodates the interests of various stakeholders, shareholders, creditors, customers, employees, the communities in which they operate. And it's the question of how it gets all of those constituencies to buy into what it's doing, to work with it, to do what it does. That's the essence of a corporation. So here's the fundamental problem, and this is in a cartoon. Maybe it's hard to see or hard to read. I'll read it to you, from Barron's just this week. So the cartoon says, it's a boss talking to a new hire. Your first week will be intensive training in our policies and procedures. And during week 2, we'll show you how we really do it, right? So the joke in the cartoon, obviously, is in the word really. These two things are different, but I think they are indeed different because the first line is about compliance. It's about policies and procedures. It's about mechanisms. It's about a technology for how the organization shall run. And the second line is about culture. It's about how we really do it. How do we do what we do here? And the implication of the cartoon is that we break the law, but that's not necessarily the implication of culture, right? So the basic claim that I want to make today is that technology is indeed corrosive of compliance, and it's corrosive of the firm, the culture of the firm. And there are two subclaims. And one is easy in the sense of it's more intuitive and it'll be easier to argue, and one is harder because it's less intuitive. The easier one is that the way in which technology is used in organizations harms the compliance function by harming culture. And because culture, in order for compliance to succeed at the organizational level, in Jim's talk, he kept talking about the productivity of the compliance officer, which is, that's one way of talking about compliance, but another way of talking about compliance is, does the organization engage in right action, right? And that is not as easy to measure, and that, my argument is corroded by an over-reliance on technology and compliance. So that's the easier, more intuitive argument, which I will make. And then the slightly harder, less intuitive argument is that the nature of technologized compliance or mechanized compliance occludes the nature of the firm and really leads us astray. So let's do the easy one first. The way in which technology most typically comes into a compliance function. It's not the only way, especially if you define technology broadly, but the most obvious way in which technology comes into the firm is the way in which Jim was treating it, principally in the surveillance function. Now, I mentioned already the sentencing guidelines. The sentencing guidelines have 7 elements. One of the elements is monitoring. Monitoring means surveillance, so every firm has to have this. All right. So at a compliance conference that we held at Fordham about a year ago, we had the chief compliance officers of Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley. And the Goldman guy said, every month we record, if you play it end to end, 10 years worth of voice. So he's got the technology in place at Goldman to record everything that everyone says at Goldman Sachs. And the Morgan Stanley guy chimes in and says, we have 3 million email communications a day at our organization, reading between the lines, that we capture and monitor. And so this is obviously a problem, and they were discussing this as a technological problem. The problem is, well, what the hell are we supposed to do with this? And then they told the answer, they gave us the answer. We're all in the same boat, they said, in terms of trying to use big data providers to pull together lots of information from lots of different data sources within the organization. And you all know what big data is. Big data is what captured the Boston Marathon bomber, a big algorithm that crunches all kinds of data points that are not obviously related in any way. Big data is also, of course, what the NSA uses to snoop on all of us every day. So let's compare what they said. We're all in this boat in terms of trying to use big data providers to pull together lots of different information from lots of different sources in the organization, to this line from a book that you've heard of called 1984. Any sound that Winston made above the level of a very low whisper could be picked up by the monitoring device. Moreover, as long as he remained within the field of vision which the metal plaque commanded, he could be seen as well as heard. There was, of course, no way of knowing whether you're being watched at any moment, how often, or on what system the thought police plugged into any individual were guesswork. Right, and so here's the problem, right? We have great surveillance technologies, better than George Orwell could ever have imagined. We can actually, so the trouble with George Orwell in 1984 is that he's thinking, okay, somebody has to plug this switch to snoop on this one person, but we don't have to do it that way because we have an algorithm that can run all these pieces of data together and automatically snoop on everyone at every moment. So what's wrong with that? Now, what was wrong with it in 1984 was that it destroyed Winston's freedom, right, and his sense of his morale, and that's exactly the problem with it still. So last week or 2 weeks ago, there was a quotation in the Financial Times about employee surveillance at work. And the quotation from the Financial Times, I'll just read it, I didn't put it on a slide. Even when employers are open and clear about what they monitor and why, they risk giving the impression that they do not trust their own staff. If you act like you cannot trust them, you should not be surprised when they act like they cannot be trusted. Now, that's a quotation from the Financial Times about employee surveillance, but any parent of a teenager could tell you that is exactly true, right? If you treat your teenager like the teenager is not trustworthy, the teenager won't be trustworthy. So here's the bigger problem. The destruction of that sense of morale, that sense of you're watching me because you don't trust me, that sense of you don't trust me, that sense of I'm not to be trusted is a destruction of the way in which the culture of the firm, in order for the culture to operate effectively. And this has been studied by folks in organizational psychology. So it's, and so for example, Lynn Payne and Tom Tyler, organizational psychologists, and I won't lead you through their arguments in too much detail, but essentially what they find is that that programs that focus on small group, shared values, where everyone is equally concerned about dignity and fairness, are, in their research, more effective than policies and procedures-oriented programs. Okay, and there's a long line of research on that, which is in the paper. So that's the easy argument, right? Kablam! technology destroys that by making these people feel like they're being watched or not trusted. Therefore, they're not going to have that sense of fairness and shared values and morale, and they'll act like they shouldn't be trusted, and then you'll get the London whale. Okay. That's argument number one. That's the easy argument. Here's argument number two, which is the slightly less intuitive one, and the one comes straight from Heidegger. So Heidegger says, look, if you want to understand how technology harms being, think about the Rhine River. So here it is. Here's the vision of the Rhine. Here's one vision of the Rhine River, and this is the one that Heidegger is referring to. He's referring to a poem by someone whose name I can't pronounce, Hölderlin. Okay, and in Hölderlin's poetry, the Rhine is this powerful thing that flows out of the mountains and is the gateway to the sea. It leads past all of these villages and is this beautiful sort of thing like that. And then Heidegger says, now with technology, the Rhine is damned and it's a source of power for German industry. And it's a different thing. It transforms the being such that we don't see the Rhine as Hölderlin saw the Rhine anymore. We see the Rhine as a source of power to make cars or whatever. What I want to say is that compliance is like damming the Rhine. Compliance is mechanized compliance, which is to say check-a-box compliance of any type, or the elements of an effective compliance program, however defined, is a form of technology that imposes on firms a being that hides their actual being. It occludes being. It distorts the organic governance function of a firm, the ability of a firm through its board of directors and other stakeholder constituencies to define how it should be governed, and it destroys culture in the way that I just said. Now, where is this distortion coming from? Where is it coming from? And Jim said, so Jim asked whether compliance officers are using technology, and they are. And he also mentioned why. And the answer why is that the government is telling us to, right? The government is the source of the sentencing guidelines. The government, through the Department of Justice and the SEC and other regulators like FINRA that Jim mentioned, is the source of the way in which compliance is performed. The government makes rules, writes the rules down. So for example, in the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act guide, there is a set of compliance principles for all organizations to follow, which is more robust, by the way, than the 7 elements. And then in addition, the government sort of adds stuff when it speaks about compliance. So the Department of Justice will send people out to give speeches, and the prosecutors that are giving these speeches will say things like, well, so here's Leslie Caldwell in a speech. What she says is, this is just a random example. They give speeches like this all the time. A company should assign responsibility to senior executives for the implementation and oversight of the program. Those executives should have the authority to report directly to independent monitoring bodies, including internal audit and the board, and they should have autonomy from management. She's just arranged the governance of a firm. She's basically just said a firm has to be governed according to this way. That's not, she hasn't made the law when she does that. She says they should. We like it. We like it this way. Well, any compliance officer that or general counsel or board member that's worried about these things is going to be told by their general counsel what she just said, and they're going to strongly consider designing their function this way. So it comes from the government, and the government's imposition of mechanized compliance occludes being. So here's the question, here's the tricky question. Why on earth aren't firms railing against this? Why don't we have corporations standing up and saying, this is absurd, governance belongs to us. Governance is a matter between the board of directors and our various stakeholder constituencies. How dare you occlude being? Of course, they would never say, how dare you occlude being? But how dare you tell us how to do our business? And the answer, I love German philosophy, so I thought I'd put up a picture of Friedrich Nietzsche, especially since we're in Brooklyn, and his facial hair is Brooklyn-esque. And so why don't we have it? Because so Nietzsche had this idea of the eternal return. We always come back to this hellish place because the firms, we the firms, want the safe harbor that having an effective, in quotations, compliance program implies. So if the government is going to say what an effective compliance program is and offer mitigation or a sweetheart deal in our settlement, we want that. It's like a drug that we're addicted to. We don't want to go off onto our own and design a compliance program from scratch because the government's telling us to do it this way. We would rather do it this way. We'd rather check a box and engage in mechanized compliance than take the risk of not doing it that way. The government needs to get out of compliance. Is the bottom line. In order for firms to have effective compliance functions, the government should enforce the law fully. And once the government enforces the law, and just slip out of philosophy and back into economics, firms will have the incentive to prevent legal violations within the firm. They'll design a compliance function that does that. But the government doesn't need to tell them how to design a compliance function. There's no market distortion that prevents them, that takes away the incentive of the firm to do it. Because I can't resist it, I'm going to read one last thing. So this is a quotation from Werner Heisenberg that Heidegger makes. It's about technology, and it's a Chinese proverb. So as Sun Tzu was traveling through the regions north of the River Han, he saw an old man working in a vegetable garden. The man had dug up an irrigation ditch. The man would descend into the well, fetch up a vessel of water in his arms, and pour it out into the ditch. While his efforts were tremendous, the results appeared to be very meager. Sun Tzu said, there is a way whereby you can irrigate 100 ditches in one day, and whereby you can do so much with very little effort. Would you like to hear of it? The gardener stands up, looks at him and says, what would that be? Sun Tzu replies, you take a wooden lever, weight it at the back, and light in the front. In this way you can bring up water so quickly that it gushes out. This is called a draw well. So here's the point of the story. Then anger rose up in the man's face. He said, I have heard my teacher say that whoever uses a machine does all his work like a machine. He who does his work like a machine grows a heart like a machine. And he who carries the heart of a machine in his breast loses his simplicity. He who has lost his simplicity becomes unsure in the strivings of his soul. Uncertainty in the strivings of the soul is something which does not agree with honest sense. I do not know of such things, and I am ashamed to use them. The point of technology and compliance is that it's like the irrigation ditch. We can't not use technology, but how we should be aware of technology. We should be aware of what technology does to the being of the firm, to what the firm is, to the DNA of a business organization. And the way in which the firm uses technology should be determined by the firm, not imposed upon the firm by an outside source. Thanks.
We will now turn to our commenters, and we'll do that kind of the way they're seated here and the way they are in the program. So our first commenter will be Jane Cantor, who is an alum of this law school, and now Chief Operating Officer, General Counsel, and Partner of ARK Investment Manager.
Great. Hi. Hello. I hope this thing is working. Well, okay, great. So I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to talk to you today. I have to admit that I had thought that commenting on the interrelationship between compliance and technology in the financial services field would be pretty easy. I guess I will get to why I think it's easy. In any event, on the surface, at least it seems to me that technology can dramatically improve the efficiency of compliance officers in monitoring their firm's adherence to applicable regulations. And, well, maybe at least some of us can agree that the intricacy and the interrelationship, the number of regulations, have grown over time, and the scrutiny of regulators has amplified and has been increasingly challenging for financial services firms to be in compliance and to remain in compliance with applicable regulations. I think I'll go back to one moment, just an unplanned moment in this talk where I was outside counsel to a chief compliance officer of an unnamed firm who said to me, this was of course before all of the regulations were put in place for investment companies and investment advisors, that the Investment Company Act and the 1940 Act were merely a guide for him to use in considering what he might do. Now you might say that's kind of a firm culture, but who knows? I'll digress and go back to what I was going to be saying. So also the size and geography and the complexity and range of products offered has increased, making it extremely challenging for compliance professionals to do their job. The hypothesis here seems to be that technology is a truly bad thing. I guess I can say maybe on the outset here that I am the co-founder of a firm that's main objective is to invest in disruptive technology as our starting point for all of our decision making. So I guess you could say I have a prejudice for technology versus against it. And I frankly don't believe it is an evil and bad thing that is actually going to adversely affect people's lives or imprison them or otherwise warp their thinking. But of course, that's just one person's personal view. Anyway, but back to the speech. So the answer to, what the proposition is that, I guess I could say technology is evil and it warps the values of those who use it, I guess is not a simple thing, and it depends on a lot of factors. However, I generally believe that technologically enabled compliance will enable financial services firms to better understand and address their growing compliance needs, and will permit them to have additional time to provide more hands-on advice regarding mission-critical issues. Let me just stop there. I mean, you could always do things. If you're a small firm like mine, you could do everything manually. Is that the best use of someone's time? Or is a better use of someone's time to find some outsourced solution so that my time and the time of someone else who's on the legal or compliance side might be able to actually focus on the really important things we're doing versus worrying about if someone is breaking a rule that has to do with their personal trading. In any event, at least one factor that should be considered is the size of the firm. Of course, the size and reach and complexity of financial services firms is one thing that we all need. CC expects large firms with significant resources to dedicate adequate capital to creating robust analytics and surveillance systems. And why shouldn't they think that? I mean, after all, they do have the resources. Why can't they do it? So is it one size fits all? Of course not. My tiny little firm, not even $1 billion in assets under management. Do I have the resources that Goldman Sachs or Morgan Stanley or even my co-panelist here has? No, I really don't. So with our maybe less complex products and the smallness of the firm, we have actually been handling all of our compliance issues manually. I discovered this on Monday when I became the interim chief compliance officer.
Welcome to the job.
Oh my God! It's like I was saying to myself, "Are you kidding me? You were not actually using technology tools to do these things." So, there is an assumption here that sort of manually handling things might be preferable. I really have to absolutely disagree with that. I mean, certainly there are, all compliance issues aren't equal, and some require greater amounts of time and resources, data analytics, that means technology, to understand and address. Is that so bad? Well, I don't think so. You know, there certainly are some things that, by the way, I will be outsourcing to people, or I will be bringing in technology to do. I hope to God that personal trading will be something I don't have to think about, and that, you know, I will then be able to spend a little bit of more of my time until I find a chief compliance officer. Any of you out there interested in talking to me, please come and talk to me after this. We'll be able to provide a more personal touch in shaping the firm's culture. The other point, I guess, that was raised is that that because the compliance functions are being centralized by larger firms and compliance surveillance is increasingly being done remotely, far away from the actual activity, to cut compliance costs, this is somehow a tremendous problem. Well, okay, in my mind, again, that may or may not be the case. It is one of those one-size-doesn't-fit-all things. So, for example, if I were to take the compliance function of my firm and move it to Detroit, which, by the way, that's where it was, I don't know that that's such a bad thing. I mean, we believe in technology, so we were able to talk to our chief compliance officer all the time, every single day. What was the problem of having her in Detroit if I could have her at a cheaper rate doing a great job because she had a lot of experience? But again, if the point of moving them off-site was to obfuscate what was going on and to minimize the effectiveness of the chief compliance officer, and that, I guess, is a bigger problem, a different problem, a cultural problem. So the real issue isn't whether centralized bundling is per se a problem. It's whether you can take the function to maybe use it, maybe have it at a different location, but couple it with boots on the ground, with periodic visits, with other ways to communicate better. Again, of course, using technology, but I don't also think that that's such a bad thing. So, moreover, if the use of centralization of compliance is wrong in a particular instance or for particular products or firms, then the answer is for the relevant compliance officer to assert their influence and to make it clear that the program isn't structured properly in order to detect and prevent compliance violations. But if they're afraid or unwilling to do this, then there's clearly a bigger problem. So, for example, if my compliance officer, Amy, had said to me, I can't do this job from Detroit, I would have found another solution, okay? But she didn't say that. And she certainly had the opportunity. And I think one of the real issues on the compliance world that we're not talking about here at all is the fear of some compliance officers to actually provide face-to-face advice. Actually, some of them might actually want to be off-site somewhere else. And, well, that's a whole other issue. So I'm not sure that centralization of compliance functions means that there would be worse compliance, a decreased number of compliance officers. In fact, I think, as I'm sure some of you will be talking about, the expertise needed by a firm's compliance department to understand and analyze complex products and intercompany relations seems to point to the need for a greater number of compliance officers, or compliance officers that have or compliance staff that has very specific expertise. The other issue that was talked about was how this whole use of technology is going to strip the firm of its values, impact it negatively, and ultimately destroy it. So I don't know. Maybe I don't understand because I've only been a compliance officer for 5 days, but I don't think that the chief compliance officer or the compliance team is the only part of what's going on in a firm's culture. I mean, the SEC has said all the time, it's the tone at the top. It is what's been articulated by the chief executive officer, the president, the chief operating officer, other members of the management team that's really critical to the firm's vision and compliance culture. Also, its board. So while I certainly understand how important it is that the compliance team and the compliance officer have some impact and influence on that, I don't believe that they're the heart and soul of what's going on in any organization. If you start with the CEO and that person doesn't believe in compliance, doesn't feel that it's critical to the firm, doesn't really have good values, you could have the best compliance system in the world, you could have the most dedicated compliance officers, and you're not going to have a culture of compliance, and you're going to have problems, and you're going to have people who are thinking to themselves, that person has cut corners, and so can I. So where do we go from here? I don't believe the question of whether technology helps or hurts compliance is the critical issue, although, I guess the answer could be both. That history shows that technology-enabled innovations in many areas, including compliance, will continue to move forward at an accelerated pace. That's, by the way, Moore's law. So what does that mean? You're going to have even more things going on, more changes raised, and more issues raised by technology that need our attention. So realizing that that's going to happen, realizing that there'll be more technology in our lives, and we should be embracing it instead of being repulsed by it, might be a beginning first step. So if the fear is that the need for the number of compliance officers will be reduced and that will impact our values, then I guess we're now taking note of that fact. And I guess we should be thinking about how we can improve things to make sure that that isn't going to happen. After all, knowledge is the first step in solving a problem. But to be blunt, I welcome the future and the power that technology can bring to handling our regulatory and compliance needs. I hope that by outsourcing some of our compliance tasks to specialized providers and internally using technology more effectively, we will be able to do a better and more meaningful job in a more complex environment. If we're unwilling or unable or afraid, we're missing the freedom from routine compliance tasks that technology can bring us, and the opportunity to add even greater value than before. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I don't think you've been thinking about this for only 5 days, so it's a pleasure to hear your comments, and we'll now go on to David Liu, who is a principal of Galliard Capital Management, Inc.
Thank you very much, and thank you to Jim for having us at the conference. This is a very provocative topic, and I was having dinner with Jim last night, and he told me that a very significant proportion of the students here will go on into compliance roles, and that makes a lot of sense to me. Maybe 20%, Jim, I think you said. So this isn't an academic conference for a lot of you. It's going to be the nuts and bolts and the guts of your life's work. So it's important, and it's topics that we in the industry think about every day. Just to give you a little bit of background about where I come from. So I graduated law school in 1988. So it's a long time since I was a second-year law student. But I went on into a world where I was drafting prospectuses for mutual funds and doing minutes for board meetings. And when compliance roles opened up, I became the chief compliance officer for the Charles Schwab family of funds. Went on from there to be the chief compliance officer at Franklin Templeton, and then moved to Minneapolis because it was a very wonderful job opportunity to do the compliance work as the CCO for U.S. Bancorp Asset Management. And now I'm a principal at an $85 billion subsidiary of Wells. So I've been thinking about these issues for 25 years, and they're difficult. I think there are two things really going on that are worthy of taking note, sort of a bifurcation. And I've hired many hundreds of people for compliance roles. And I often tell friends that if it's not a graduate of Brooklyn Law School that shows up on my doorstep, I often look for a musician. And they look at me funny. They say, why would you look for a musician? I said, because a musician understands the balance that's needed between creativity on one hand and discipline on the other. I don't have to describe to that person that, I'm trying to do something that, you have to hit the right notes. But you have to hit the right notes and not be a slave to the fact that in being creative and doing something that you're putting together your thoughts to create controls that are useful, you really have to let your mind flow free and then say, what systems can I put in place to monitor that? So this bifurcation of creativity and discipline will, I think, show up in terms of what's been expressed here as culture versus technology, because the technology is the discipline, but you can't let it overtake the creativity that's necessary that lets the culture fly free and be uplifted. Federal sentencing guidelines is sort of where compliance lives in a lot of industries, but not so much in financial services. So in the financial services, so where compliance came from was this place that if your corporation was found guilty of X, Y, and Z, if you had done training, if you had done this and that and the other thing, you'd get a lesser sentence. So you'd be held a little less liable. You'd get credit for the extra credit work of compliance. The SEC, under John's leadership when he was there, created a series of rules that we call the compliance rules, and they all have the same kind of cadence to them. And the requirement's very simple. You need a chief compliance officer. That created jobs for my entire life. That chief compliance officer is responsible for facilitating the creation.
You're welcome.
Well, I've done favors for you too. So that chief compliance officer is responsible for the creation of procedures, facilitation of the creation of procedures, which might be a better way to put that. And then you have to have an annual report on breaches of your policies and procedures. And if they're material, it has to be reported up to boards and to senior management, et cetera, et cetera. As a chief compliance officer, the hook is that you have personal liability if you know of these issues or should have known of those issues and you don't report them out. And as I'm listening to the speakers and I'm thinking about productivity and technology, I think back to an argument that I had with an SEC examiner maybe 15 or 20 years ago that the examiner was in our shop and they said, you people, why do you make this stuff so complicated? It could be so simple. I said, complicated? It's not us, it's you. I say, all our people excel in looking for the seams between rules. So you make your rules, and the rule has a seam, and here's a brick, and there's a brick, and of course the weeds are going to go right between the seams of the two bricks. And so what do? You lay another round of bricks down, and now what do the weeds do? So now they're like this. And when you look at the product, you're wondering why it twists and turns through a dozen cracks in the bricks. It's because of where you've laid the bricks. It's not because of what we wanted to do, because the place where our people make money are in these seams between the bricks. I think the technology discussion that we're having could have hearkened me back to that discussion, because on the one hand, the technology is making you more productive, but on the other hand, it's opening the door for much more complicated regulation. And the complications in the regulation, there's only about 7 ways to steal money from an investment company client. There's 7 deadly sins. People who I talked to who were in the business in 1954 talk about them the same way as someone in 1974 and 1994 and 2014. I could tell you, but you know, you have to find out for yourself. But the rules that govern how those reasonably simple concepts are dealt with become more and more complicated. So yes, there will be an increase in productivity that creates a smaller number of jobs for that space, but by the same token, the space that the gas is filling is becoming much larger, because all of a sudden that increase in technology opens the logical door to create more rules governing these 7 deadly sins. So which is it? Is it a chicken, an egg, a cart, a horse? I'm not sure, but I don't think it's going to create less jobs for you all. I think you're well served in having a background in compliance, because this little puppy is here to stay. Okay, so now what's the impact in my world of technology? And I'd say it's SEC big data, because what's happening is the SEC has come to the understanding that they have more number crunching ability than any of us. And it opens the query as you listen to this, how compliance is used by industry, right? Is it friend or foe? Because a lot of my thinking as time has gone on is that the bigger firms in the world will protest about these rules and compliance, but what they really create is, yeah, it's costing them more money, but it's an absolute bar to entry for smaller firms. So I think it's a facilitation of monopolies in the United States among some of the largest firms, because with these rules, you can't have a small firm who can create the systems, and the best you can be as a chief compliance officer at a smaller firm becomes a general contractor, because you have to contract with people who can offer you the services to crunch the numbers. And what are the big dogs doing? What's happening at the government? Well, their systems, NEAT and MIDAS, the things that they're using to track the millions of data points that you give them as trades and emails, et cetera, huge amounts of data. When I was at Schwab for my first exams, they said, give us an hour of your emails. Okay, it was like 360,000 emails. It was something ridiculous. I said, okay, well, how about 15 minutes? 32,000. Well, how about 5 minutes? 10,000. And they got down to about 15 seconds. That was the amount of emails that they could review, right? Because they just took a random 15 seconds to see if there was anybody creating a fraud in those 15 seconds. Well, now, if for the one case that I self-reported to the SEC in my career, people had to go through maybe 200,000 emails, and those were all for those of you who don't go into compliance your first year, that's what you'll be doing as a junior lawyer at some firm. You'll be reading 300,000 emails looking for, some pattern of activity. But so what the SEC is doing is they're partnering with the Department of Defense, and it becomes this confluence of securities trading and the industrial military complex to say, okay, give us these systems. Do you have systems that can analyze data? Sure, we have systems that can analyze data. Well, what's your biggest, baddest, and best system? Well, what you're talking about feels a lot to us at DoD like what we use in Iron Dome to track missile entry. So when we're looking for patterns on where a pattern of trading is going, that feels a lot to us like the arc of an incoming missile and how to intercept it. And you can give us your 300 million data points, and we'll analyze it for patterns, which would be like a pattern of incoming missiles. And those are the systems, those were the base route from the US Navy of what the SEC is using to analyze trading data. And no firm except the largest firms in the country can possibly compete with that, right? If you're a small firm, you have to go outsource to try and get someone who has something so that when the SEC examiner walks in, you'll have some hint as to what that person might have in their file. So it used to be that when I would prepare for an exam, I'd say, okay, what do they have? They have our old deficiency letter, they have our response, they're going to look at whether we've done the actual response. They have newspaper clippings on our firm, they have complaint letters. I could sort of tell what the file was going to be, right, that the examiner had coming in. But now, they've asked me in advance, maybe a couple of months, give us these, 10 gigabytes, 10 terabytes of data. And John made a wonderful point at a conference. It was not how many boxes are you giving me, it becomes how many libraries of Congress are you giving me, because the amount of data that's being transferred between the firms and the SEC is massive. And a person handling the exam can't possibly analyze that all themselves. So that big data becomes a real threat, that the only way I can create a shield around my firm is really to find an outsourcing partner that can match what DoD is doing, right? So threat or friend or foe? Is data friend or foe? I mean, certainly it's making the wheels turn faster, but I don't think that results in less jobs for us all, because there are bigger wheels to turn. So, okay, so where's this all taking us? I think that I view technology more as a disruptive force than a threat per se. Definitely a disruption. Our disruption, as James was saying, disruptions don't have to be bad. That's where value is created in the world, when an old system is put asunder and a new system comes up. Jim, as to between rules compliance and values compliance, it's very much where the types of, John and I have put together a book that you're a contributor to. And it's very much the idea of what are the best practices in an industry. What do you do not just to follow the rules, but what are the best practices? And the best practices will often not be the floor, which is the minimum. It's something bigger. When I talk to people about this and try to explain it, I say, if we were on a ship together, the compliance person might be sort of like the night watchman, walking around the empty decks of the ship in the dark, and you're making sure the watertight doors are closed, and are the running lights on, and everything sound right. And risk management has this feel of someone in the crow's nest looking for icebergs, right? You're now going beyond the running of the ship to say, okay, what's on the horizon? What can I see that might be endanger my ship? Ethics, the ethics of a firm, is where's the ship going? It could be perfectly seaworthy, it could be perfectly sound, but until you get into the blockhouse and you're in with the captain, the culture of compliance, you don't know where the ship is going. Could it be a perfectly running firm engaging in child pornography? Absolutely. The compliance person can make sure all the rules are followed, and could be a firm for a perfectly horrible purpose. The job of a compliance person who excels at their work is to try and elevate yourself from being the night watchman to going into the captain's blockhouse and saying, okay, where is this ship going, and how can I help you using the tools that I have, which are ethics and tone and culture, to make the ship run better. I used to have the guy who trained me in compliance was a fellow who was maybe about 15, 20 years older than me. And he said, David, look around you. There are no old people in compliance. Compliance is totally a young person's profession. And why so? Because everywhere in someone's career, maybe 5 to 7 years, you hit an issue that you just can't survive. There's something going on that you can't get them to change X, Y, and Z, and you can't live with yourself for doing it. So compliance jobs tend to have a half-life, unless you're a potted plant. If you're a potted plant, you could stay at a place forever, right? But if you're passionate about a work, it tends to have a half-life that tends you to cycle through the industry. So to newcomers coming into compliance, don't be afraid of taking a job with compliance, and don't be afraid of leaving it either. Thank you.
So our final commenter on this panel is John Walsh, who's with the Sutherland, Asheville, and Brennan firm.
Great, thank you. And thank you very much for having me. And I'd like to thank Brooklyn Law School for putting this together. And Jim and Sean, I can tell you your presentations, I think, have been very thought-provoking. And anything I say at this point is going to be preliminary. as I think through your presentations. And let me just give a little bit of background on myself. I'm a long-term regulator. I'm now in private practice. As a regulator, I was involved in, well, I worked in enforcement for a while, and then I worked in examination, so I was involved a lot of times in the more investigative side of things. And today, I do a lot of internal investigation. So I'm really going to focus on some of the practical issues here, how technology is having a practical impact. Though Sean, before I turn to the practical issues, I have to admit, I've never thought of Mr. Heidegger as someone who was willing to take a stand against overbearing authority, but maybe that's just me. Okay.
There's that part of his career.
Okay. Well, I have three thoughts. As I listened to the presentations, three thoughts came to me that I would like to highlight. First, do we have a choice? I think with technology, we do not have a choice. That we are not driving this. Technology is driving us. And let me tell you an examiner's anecdote. And it's apocryphal, but it made the rounds, and I love it. And it really could be applied to almost any situation. Group of SEC examiners go to a firm, a quant firm, and they sit down with the head of compliance, and they say, you know, we're here to try and understand your trading strategy. Can you understand it to us, please? And the head of compliance says, guys, I'm really sorry. I hate to tell you. Years ago, I could have told you. Today, totally over my head, I have no idea. You got to go down to the trading desk. And they go to the trading desk. And they say, could you explain your trading strategy? And the guys down at the trading desk said, hey, you know, not that long ago, we were the big dogs around here, no more. You know, we don't run the place anymore. It's the programmers run the place. You got to go to the programmers. So they go to the programming department at 2 o'clock in the morning when everyone's there, and they say, guys, you got to explain to us, how do the programs run your trading strategy? And the programmers say, you know, not that long ago, we were involved in that because we wrote the original programs. But you know what? These are such good programs. They include artificial intelligence. And the programs are changing themselves. So we can tell you where they were a while ago, but we have no idea where they are today. And the story ends with the SEC exam team and this vast server farm staring at blinking servers as far as the eye can see, trying to decide which one to interview. And that's where we are today. And I think both Jim and Sean recognize this in varying degrees, that really technology is moving so quickly that the primary struggle we have today, and I think, Jane, you mentioned it very strongly, the primary challenge in front of compliance today is keeping up. And actually the reason I think it's a good story, you could take out SEC examiners, you could put in CEO, CFO, board of directors, so that the business leadership of the firm is in exactly the same position the regulators are in. And going back to Jane's comments about people selecting this and doing this, I think the answer is if you're the CEO of a company, you're facing exactly the same challenge to understand what it is you're doing. And I think that's why business is running to this. Why are the regulators worried about this? Well, regulators have this concern, and I think there is some reality to it. They talk about the business being technology rich and compliance being technology poor. And I can guarantee you, if you're with a firm, and Jane, you want to cover your ears here or maybe take notes, if they walk into a firm and the business people are loaded with all these great technological tools, and the folks in compliance have got pencils and little 3x5 cards, they're going to be concerned. They're going to be very concerned. And frankly, I have to tell you, I'm a former regulator, but I understand their concern. I understand where they're coming from. Thought number two. Jim and Sean both talked about this. They use slightly different words, but I think unquestionably technology is disruptive. And the technology that we're going through right now is highly disruptive. I think Jim called it corrosive. Sean called it corrosive. Jim talked about it as being a burden rather than a benefit to compliance. I think both of those are absolutely true. Let me give you two examples where I think the technology we're dealing with today is making it much, much more of a challenge to provide compliance. One, the nature of compliance risk. Now, in the past, compliance risk could be arrayed on a continuum where at one end of the continuum were snafus. Things happen, errors. You're not in compliance with the bright line requirements of some non-fraud rule, but you know what? Stuff happens. And then you kind of migrate through, there's a pattern that keeps happening, and then you get into there's some intentionality, people know it's happening and they don't fix it until finally you get all the way at the other end where not only is it happening and people know it and they're not fixing it, but it's helping the firm, it's saving them money, or it's making them money. And compliance risk generally was focused on that upper end of the scale. The mature, intentional dollars are involved. Well, what has happened because of technology? Because regulators have these technological tools now, they can go to a firm's trading blotter and they can look at every single trade and say, is this trade in compliance with the bright line requirements that govern that trade? And you know what they're doing? They're bringing enforcement cases based on those individual trades. You can go to the SEC's website and read enforcement cases where advisors managing big assets north of $1 billion and plus are getting dinged for one trade worth $20,000, one trade worth $15,000. So here, this is totally disruptive. You're in compliance, and you have this idea of what is the risk you're dealing with. And today it goes all the way down to that one small dollar non-intentional trade. Wow, that's a huge change to risk. Completely disruptive, driven by technology. Number two, another change, the nature of red flags. In compliance, red flags, which I think probably everyone knows, it's anything that warns you that things are not right, something's wrong, is a red flag. Red flags have been totally transformed. And here again, I think Sean in particular recognized this in his presentation, talking about how people have vast databases full of information that they know what's down, they know something is down there, but they don't really know what it is. And because of that, red flags have changed from something active. A red flag used to be the one good thing is it was something happened. As a technical matter, there's always the negative red flag. The most famous one, of course, is Sherlock Holmes, the dog that didn't bark. So, there are things like that. But by active, typically something has happened. It's affirmative. Well, we're now in an environment, and this is why it's so disruptive, we're now in an environment where there are huge databases of passive red flags, communications that are going to be held against you and your firm, data that's going to be held against you and your firm that no one's looked at and no one really can look at until somebody says, we need to dig in and focus on this particular issue, whether it's an examiner, an enforcement investigation, or an internal investigation. And I can tell you, bad stuff comes out every time. It's one thing you can be sure of when you start to look at these passive red flags. People will be surprised in ways they don't like. So Jim asked the question, can we start laying off compliance professionals? No, you got to hire more. The reality is the risk profile has changed. The nature of the issues have changed. We need more compliance. We need more people. Firms are more at risk than they used to be. And the third thought, and Roberta, I'm sorry, I recognize I'm running low on time. I'll be quick. The third thought is, and this is where I think both Jim and Sean, I really enjoyed their presentations. And I think that both of them, I would say, focused on this, and I totally agree with them. This is an important area. And that is, what is technology doing to our understanding of compliance as an operational function, as to how compliance operates? And both of them drew attention. I think Jim said it was between legal compliance and values compliance. Sean talked about mechanized compliance versus cultural compliance. And I agree with him. There is a lot of tension. I'd slice it slightly differently. I would say it's between what I would call technological compliance and, for want of a better word, human factors compliance. You could call it quantitative versus qualitative, objective versus subjective. It doesn't really matter. The important thing is there is this tension. And again, let me, if I may, tell a war story. When I first started doing examinations, I had the opportunity to go out with people who had been doing them for decades and were incredibly experienced. And they were very interesting people. They used no checklist. We don't need no stinking checklist. We know what we're doing. You never knew what they were going to do. They were totally unpredictable, even to the people on the same team. They wrote nothing down, but they had this incredible intuitive knowledge and an incredible intuitive sense as to what they were doing. And I'll never forget, if I could tell my own personal exam story, though, I was on the exam team, sitting in a conference room with one of these senior experienced examiners, and he's not doing anything. You know, we're all looking at things and taking notes, and he's just sitting there. He's looking around, and every once in a while he goes, you know, I don't like this place. I really don't like this place. And we're kind of looking at him like, what? And he says, there's something wrong here. And finally, I know you've heard this story, David, and finally he says, I know what it is. It's the art. And I kind of looked at the picture and I said, yeah, you know, you're right. I was admiring it myself. It's great art. It's beautiful. And he says, no. My question is, how can a firm that has the revenues they're showing us in the cash journal afford art like that? Where did the money come from to buy that art? And you know what the funny thing is? It turned out that was a darn good question. And to me, that's classic, subjective, impressionistic, intuitive compliance. And there's a role for that. And I think actually one of the things I'm most worried about today, with all of this big data and all of this technology, we're actually losing sight of the role of that kind of subjective compliance. And just so you all understand, both as a regulator and as someone on the outside sense who tries to tell the regulators what they should do, which I do, I'm a big fan of big data. I think it's important. Back in the Dodd-Frank era, when I was active in the exam program, I took the role in pushing for better surveillance and better surveillance tools up on Capitol Hill. But having all of that aside, where there's subjectivity involved in what compliance is doing, compliance should be subjective as well. The classic example for me is if you're at a retail firm, why a particular retail client chooses to trust a particular salesperson and buy something consistent with what that salesperson recommends is one of those mysterious human things that I would put in the same order as why two people in a couple decide of all the people in the world they like each other more. It's very mysterious, it's very subjective, and to provide compliance for that, you need subjectivity, you need that qualitative insight. So let me get to the bottom line here. Is technology a threat or a benefit? Well, like my colleagues have said, I'm going to go really strongly and unequivocally with both. No question, it's both. Is it a threat? You bet. It is disruptive. We are running hard to try and keep up. Frankly, we're not doing a very good job. The compliance algorithms are not keeping up with the business algorithms. And there's a lot of risk in that. Secondly, though, is it a benefit? Yes. And I think to the extent it can replace the more mechanistic activities, the sorting, the shifting, the highlighting the abnormality, and then the individual compliance professional can use their investigative skills and their judgment to follow up and to do something about it. Yes, it'll be a good thing. But the jury's out on this one. And as I look down the road 5 years, I can see technology being disruptive and leaving a mess in compliance. I can see it being a good thing too, but I think it's really too early to call the result. And Roberta, thank you very much for your patience in letting me go over.
Well, thank you. I'm going to close this panel with a little story from my own career to bring us back to the basic question that Jim asked at the beginning. Contrasting legal and values compliance. In between college and law school, I worked in a small over-the-counter trading brokerage house in Boston. There were 6 traders. They traded a lot of stocks from the companies that ringed Route 128 in Boston. It was kind of the Silicon Valley of its day, and some stodgy New England utilities. I sat in the trading room, which was probably a little smaller than this room, or about the same size. I had a desk with a Frieden calculator. The traders all had position limits. I all day long, figured out the positions they were taking, and they would shout over to me, can I take on this trade? Can I take on that trade? Can I take on this trade? They were supposed to be flat at the end of the day, and I'd say, yes, no, yes, no. It was very chaotic and noisy. I guess I was a compliance officer. I guess I was even a risk officer. Was this legal compliance or value compliance? I certainly, in those days, had not heard about the securities laws or even the SEC, and I don't know that those traders had either. So I don't think it was legal compliance. It was values compliance, but what was the value? The value was for the firm to make as much money as they could trading every day with the least amount of risk. That wasn't very poetic, like the story that you told, but this is the value of a lot of financial firms. So I think today you don't have firms like that anymore. You don't have a Freedom calculator that is the tool, the technological tool to help with compliance, because firms have gotten so huge, the business is so complex, and there's so much regulation that we live in a different world, and yet I think the basic problems of running a firm are very much the same.